The morning fog rolled in from the Pacific Ocean like a soft blanket, covering the small coastal town of Redwood Beach in its familiar embrace. Alice Morgan stood at the window of her small apartment above the hardware store on Main Street, watching the mist swirl around the streetlights below. At 67 years old, she had seen this sight countless times over the past 15 years, and it never failed to bring her a sense of peace. She moved away from the window and walked to her small kitchen, her movements practiced and efficient. The coffee maker was already brewing, filling the apartment with its rich aroma. Alice poured herself a cup and added a splash of cream, exactly the way she liked it. She sat at her small kitchen table and looked around the modest space that had been her home for so long. The apartment was simple but comfortable. A small living room with a worn but clean sofa, a bookshelf filled with mystery novels and cooking books, and a few photographs on the walls. Most of the photos showed the town of Redwood Beach, the harbor at sunset, the main street during the annual summer festival, the lighthouse on the northern point. There were no personal photos, no family pictures, nothing that spoke of a life before this place. Alice finished her coffee and stood up. It was time to get ready for work. She walked to her bedroom and changed into her work uniform: black pants, a white button-down shirt, and comfortable shoes. She tied her silver gray hair back into a neat bun and looked at herself in the mirror. Her face showed the lines of 67 years, but her blue eyes were still clear and sharp. She looked like exactly what she appeared to be: a hard-working woman in her late 60s, living a quiet life in a small town. At 6:30 in the morning, Alice left her apartment and walked down the narrow stairs to the street below. Main Street was still quiet, with only a few early risers moving about. She nodded to Bill Patterson, who was opening up his bakery across the street. The smell of fresh bread wafted toward her. "Morning, Alice," Bill called out with a wave. "Good morning, Bill," Alice replied with a warm smile. "Beautiful day starting." "That it is," Bill agreed. "See you at lunchtime?" "I'll be at the restaurant as usual," Alice said. She continued down Main Street, her pace steady and unhurried. Redwood Beach was a small town with a population of just under 3,000 people. It sat on a beautiful stretch of California coastline, with rocky cliffs to the north and south, and a small harbor protected by a natural breakwater. The town made its living from tourism, fishing, and a few small businesses that served the local community. Alice had chosen this place 15 years ago because it was quiet, peaceful, and far from her previous life. Nobody here knew who she had been before. Nobody asked too many questions. The people of Redwood Beach had accepted her as she presented herself, a woman looking for a simple life in a beautiful place. Over the years, she had become part of the community, someone people knew and trusted, even if they knew very little about her past. She turned off Main Street and walked down Harbor Road toward the waterfront. The fog was beginning to lift, revealing the gray ocean beyond. Several fishing boats were already heading out for the day's work, their engines rumbling in the quiet morning. Alice watched them go, feeling the familiar tightness in her chest that she always felt when she saw boats heading out to sea. Ocean's Catch was located right on the harbor, a popular seafood restaurant that had been serving locals and tourists for over 30 years. Alice had worked there for the past 14 years, first as a part-time server and eventually as one of their most reliable full-time employees. The restaurant wasn't fancy, but it was clean, friendly, and served excellent fresh seafood. She entered through the back door and found Maria Rodriguez, the restaurant's owner, already in the kitchen, preparing for the lunch rush. "Alice, good morning," Maria said brightly. Maria was in her 50s, with dark hair streaked with gray and a warm smile that made everyone feel welcome. She had owned Ocean's Catch for the past 10 years and had always treated Alice with kindness and respect. Good morning, Maria, Alice replied. What can I help with? Can you start setting up the dining room? Maria asked. We have a reservation for a large group at noon, and I want to make sure everything is perfect. Of course, Alice said. For the next hour, Alice moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency. She checked each table, made sure the salt and pepper shakers were full, arranged the silverware, and folded napkins. She had done this routine hundreds of times, and she found comfort in the familiar tasks. There was something peaceful about this work, something that required attention but not intense thought. It was so different from her previous life. By 8 o'clock, the restaurant was ready to open. The morning shift was usually quiet, with just a few customers coming in for coffee and breakfast. Alice took her position at the front of the house, ready to greet whoever came through the door. The first customer was old Mrs. Henderson, who came in every morning for toast and tea. Alice guided her to her favorite table by the window. "How are you today, Mrs. Henderson?" Alice asked kindly. "Oh, my arthritis is acting up with this damp weather," Mrs. Henderson complained, settling into her chair with a sigh. "But I can't complain too much. At 83, I'm grateful to still be walking around." "You're an inspiration," Alice said sincerely. "I'll get your tea right away." As Alice walked to the kitchen, she thought about Mrs. Henderson's words. At 67, Alice was 15 years younger, but she understood the challenges of aging. Her own body wasn't what it used to be. Her knees sometimes ached, especially when the weather changed. Her hands weren't as steady as they once were. But she stayed active, walking every day, eating well, and taking care of herself. The morning continued with a steady stream of customers. There was Tom Wilson, who owned the hardware store below Alice's apartment. There was Jennifer Park, who ran the bookstore on Main Street. There was Carlos Santos, one of the local fishermen who always came in for a big breakfast before heading out on his boat. Alice knew all of them by name, knew their usual orders, knew bits and pieces of their lives. This was her community now. These were her people. And they had accepted her completely, never pushing her to reveal more than she wanted to share about her past. In Redwood Beach, Alice Morgan was simply Alice, reliable, friendly, hardworking, and private. Nothing more, nothing less. Around 11 o'clock, the lunch crowd started to arrive. Alice moved between tables with practiced efficiency, taking orders, bringing food, refilling drinks, and chatting pleasantly with customers. She had learned over the years how to be friendly without being overly personal, how to make people feel welcome without revealing too much of herself. The large group reservation turned out to be a family celebrating a grandmother's 80th birthday. Alice helped set up a long table for them and made sure they had everything they needed. She watched the family laugh and talk together, 3 generations gathered to honor the oldest member. It reminded her of things she had given up, choices she had made. But Alice pushed those thoughts aside. She had made her peace with her decisions long ago. This was her life now, and she had learned to find contentment in it. After the lunch rush ended, Alice had a 2-hour break before the dinner shift began. She left Ocean's Catch and walked along the harbor, enjoying the fresh sea air. The fog had completely lifted now, and the afternoon sun sparkled on the water. Several boats were returning from their morning fishing trips, and Alice could see the crews unloading their catches. She walked to the end of the pier and sat on one of the wooden benches that faced the ocean. This was her favorite spot in town, a place where she could sit and think without being disturbed. The sound of the waves against the pier supports was soothing, almost meditative. Alice closed her eyes and let the sun warm her face. Despite everything, she loved the ocean. She had spent most of her adult life on or above the water, and even after 15 years away from that life, the sea still called to her. But it was a bittersweet relationship now, filled with memories both beautiful and painful. Mind if I join you? Alice opened her eyes to see Pastor Michael Stevens standing beside the bench. He was a kind man in his early 60s who led the small community church in town. Alice wasn't particularly religious, but she attended services occasionally, and she liked Michael. He was genuine and didn't preach at people outside of church. "Please, sit," Alice said with a smile. Michael settled onto the bench with a contented sigh. "Beautiful day," he observed. "It is," Alice agreed. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the boats in the harbor. This was one of the things Alice appreciated about Redwood Beach. People here understood the value of silence. Not every moment had to be filled with conversation. "How long have you been in Redwood Beach now, Alice?" Michael asked eventually. "Must be close to 15 years." 15 years this coming October," Alice confirmed. "You're as much a part of this town as anyone who was born here," Michael said. "People trust you, respect you." Alice felt a warmth in her chest at his words. "That means a lot to me," she said quietly. "You know," Michael continued thoughtfully, "I've always admired how you live your life. You work hard, you treat people with kindness, you're always willing to help when someone needs it. But you also maintain your privacy, your boundaries. Not everyone can balance those things so well." Alice turned to look at him, wondering if this was leading somewhere. Michael noticed her expression and smiled gently. "I'm not fishing for information," he assured her. "Everyone has a right to their past, their privacy. I just wanted you to know that you're valued here, exactly as you are." "Thank you, Michael," Alice said, feeling genuine gratitude. "This town has given me more than it knows." Michael nodded and stood up. "Well, I should get back. I have a meeting with the church council about the fall festival." "Will we see you there?" "Wouldn't miss it," Alice said. After Michael left, Alice remained on the bench for a while longer. His words had touched something deep inside her. She had worried, especially in the early years, that her unwillingness to share her past would make people suspicious or unfriendly. But the opposite had happened. The people of Redwood Beach had simply accepted her reserve as part of who she was. Alice stood up and walked back along the pier toward town. She had another hour before her shift started, so she decided to stop by the library. The Redwood Beach Public Library was a small but well-maintained building on Elm Street, run by an enthusiastic librarian named Dorothy Chen. "Alice!" Dorothy greeted her warmly when she entered. "I was hoping you'd come by. I have that mystery novel you requested on hold." "Thank you, Dorothy," Alice said. "You're always so efficient." "It's my job to know what my patrons like," Dorothy said with a wink. She was in her 40s, with short black hair and glasses that made her look scholarly. "This is the latest in the series. I think you'll enjoy it." Alice checked out the book and spent a few minutes browsing the new arrivals section. The library was one of her favorite places in town. It was quiet, peaceful, and full of stories. She had always been an avid reader, and books had been her companions through many lonely evenings over the years. As she was leaving, she nearly bumped into Tommy Reeves, a young man in his late 20s who worked on his father's fishing boat. Tommy was tall and sturdy, with sun-bleached hair and a friendly smile. "Sorry, Miss Morgan," Tommy said quickly. "Wasn't watching where I was going." "No harm done, Tommy," Alice assured him. "How's the fishing been?" "Pretty good this week," Tommy replied. "Dad and I are heading out tomorrow with Marcus Chen. Should be a good haul if the weather holds." "Be safe out there," Alice said automatically. "Always am," Tommy said confidently. Alice watched him leave, feeling that familiar tightness in her chest again. She knew the ocean could be unpredictable, especially at this time of year when the weather could change quickly. But she said nothing. It wasn't her place to warn experienced fishermen about the sea. She walked back to Ocean's Catch and helped Maria prepare for the dinner service. The evening shift was usually busier than lunch, with families and couples coming in to enjoy the sunset view from the restaurant's windows. The dinner rush kept Alice busy for the next 4 hours. She moved from table to table, taking orders, serving food, clearing dishes, and managing the constant demands of a busy restaurant. Her feet ached and her back was sore, but she kept a pleasant expression on her face and treated every customer with the same courteous efficiency. It was after 9 o'clock when the last customers finally left. Alice helped Maria and the kitchen staff clean up, wiping down tables and chairs, sweeping the floors, and restocking supplies for the next day. "You look tired, Alice," Maria observed with concern. "Why don't you head home? The boys and I can finish up here." "Are you sure?" Alice asked. "Positive," Maria said firmly. "You've been on your feet since this morning. Go home, take a hot bath, and rest." Alice didn't argue. She was tired, and the idea of a hot bath was very appealing. She said goodnight to everyone and stepped out into the cool evening air. The walk home took about 15 minutes. The streets of Redwood Beach were quiet now, with most businesses closed for the night. A few restaurants and bars were still open, their lights spilling onto the sidewalks. Alice could hear music and laughter from the Anchor Tavern as she passed by. Back in her apartment, Alice ran a bath and soaked in the hot water, feeling her muscles slowly relax. She thought about her day, about the customers she had served, about the familiar routines of her life. It was a good life, a peaceful life. It wasn't exciting or dramatic, but it was hers. After her bath, Alice put on her nightgown and made herself a cup of chamomile tea. She sat in her living room with her new library book, but found herself unable to concentrate on the words. Her mind kept drifting to other thoughts, other memories. She got up and walked to the closet in her bedroom. On the top shelf, pushed to the very back, was a cardboard box. Alice rarely looked at this box, but sometimes, on nights like this, she felt compelled to open it. She pulled it down and carried it to her bed. Inside were the remnants of her previous life. A few photographs, some medals and commendations, newspaper clippings, and official documents. Alice looked through them slowly, touching each item with careful fingers. There was a photograph of her in her uniform, standing in front of a helicopter. She looked so young in the picture, probably in her early 30s. Her hair was dark then, pulled back in a regulation bun, and her face was serious and professional. It was hard to reconcile that woman with the person she was now. There were medals for valor, for service, for exceptional performance. There were newspaper articles about rescues she had participated in, storms she had flown through, lives she had saved. One headline read, "Coast Guard pilot saves family of 5 in hurricane-force winds." Another said, "Storm Alice. The legend continues." Storm Alice. That had been her nickname in the Coast Guard, because no storm was too dangerous, no conditions too severe for her to fly. She had been fearless, or at least everyone thought she was fearless. The truth was more complicated. At the bottom of the box was a photograph that Alice almost never looked at. It showed 2 women in Coast Guard uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, both grinning at the camera. Alice and Sarah, best friends, partners, the best pilot and co-pilot team in the service. This photo had been taken just 2 weeks before Sarah died. 15 years had passed, but the pain was still there, buried deep, but never truly gone. Sarah had been more than a co-pilot. She had been Alice's closest friend, the sister she never had, the person who understood her better than anyone, and Alice had failed to save her. She put the photograph back in the box, along with all the other memories, and returned it to the top shelf of the closet. Then she went to bed, but sleep was a long time coming. The memories had been stirred up, and they swirled in her mind like the fog that rolled in from the ocean each morning. Alice's career with the United States Coast Guard had begun when she was 22 years old. She had grown up in San Diego, where her father had been a commercial pilot. From her earliest memories, Alice had been fascinated by flying. Her father used to take her to the airport to watch the planes take off and land, and she would spend hours imagining herself in the cockpit. When she was 16, her father began teaching her to fly. She earned her private pilot's license at 18 and her commercial license at 20. But Alice didn't want to fly passengers on routine routes. She wanted something more challenging, more meaningful. She wanted to help people. The Coast Guard seemed like the perfect fit. It combined her love of flying with the opportunity to save lives. The training was incredibly difficult, both physically and mentally demanding. But Alice thrived on the challenge. She was one of only 3 women in her training class, and she was determined to prove that she belonged there. She completed her training at the top of her class and was assigned to Air Station San Francisco. For the first few years, she flew as a co-pilot, learning from more experienced pilots, building her skills and her confidence. She flew in fog, rain, high winds, and rough seas. She participated in countless search and rescue operations, pulling fishermen from sinking boats, rescuing hikers from cliff faces, and searching for missing vessels. When Alice was 28, she was promoted to aircraft commander, a pilot in charge of her own crew. It was a huge responsibility. She was responsible not just for flying the aircraft, but for making critical decisions during missions, for the safety of her crew, and for the lives of the people they were trying to save. That was when she met Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was 26, a newly qualified co-pilot who was assigned to Alice's crew. From their first flight together, Alice knew they were going to work well together. Sarah was skilled, calm under pressure, and had an instinct for flying that couldn't be taught. More than that, they simply clicked as people. They had the same sense of humor, the same dedication to the job, the same love of flying. Over the next few years, Alice and Sarah became the best pilot team at their station. They flew together on hundreds of missions, and they developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other. In the cockpit, they could anticipate each other's moves, communicate with just a glance, and work together with perfect coordination. They also became best friends outside of work. They went hiking together, had dinner together, celebrated holidays together. Sarah was one of the few people who truly understood Alice's dedication to the Coast Guard. She didn't think Alice was crazy for flying into storms that made other pilots nervous. She got it because she felt the same way. People started calling them the Storm Sisters because they would fly in conditions that other crews wouldn't attempt. And then Alice earned her own nickname, Storm Alice, after she successfully completed a rescue in hurricane-force winds that had other pilots shaking their heads in disbelief. Alice remembered that rescue vividly. A cargo ship had started taking on water about 50 miles offshore during a major storm. The crew had abandoned ship in life rafts, but the seas were so rough that the rafts were being thrown around like toys. The waves were 30 feet high, the winds were gusting to 80 miles per hour, and the visibility was almost zero. The incident commander had initially decided to wait for the storm to pass before attempting a rescue. But Alice had argued that the crew might not survive that long in those conditions. She had volunteered to try, and after some debate, she was given permission. The flight out to the scene had been terrifying. The helicopter was buffeted by winds, rain was so heavy that Alice could barely see, and several times they were hit by downdrafts that made the aircraft drop suddenly. But Alice kept her hands steady on the controls, kept her voice calm over the radio, and focused on the job at hand. With Sarah's help and the skill of their rescue swimmer, they had pulled all 8 crew members from the life rafts and brought them safely back to shore. The mission had taken over 3 hours in the worst conditions Alice had ever flown in. When they finally landed back at base, Alice's hands were shaking and her clothes were soaked with sweat. But they had saved 8 lives. That rescue made headlines. The Coast Guard awarded Alice and her crew commendations for valor. News crews wanted to interview her. But Alice had deflected attention to her entire team, insisting that it wasn't just her achievement, but the result of everyone working together. For the next 15 years, Alice and Sarah flew together. They were promoted through the ranks together. They became instructors, teaching younger pilots the skills they would need. They became legends within the Coast Guard community, the pilots who would fly when no one else would, who had never failed to complete a mission, who had saved more lives than anyone could count. Alice loved that life. She loved the challenge of flying in difficult conditions. She loved the adrenaline rush of a successful rescue. She loved knowing that her skills and courage were making a real difference in the world. And she loved working alongside Sarah, her best friend and trusted partner. But every career has risks, and search and rescue flying is one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Alice and Sarah had experienced close calls before. Equipment failures, unexpected weather changes, moments when things could have gone very wrong but didn't. Each time, they had learned from the experience and become better pilots. But on a stormy October night when Alice was 52 and Sarah was 50, their luck ran out. A fishing vessel had sent out a distress call about 40 miles offshore. The boat was taking on water and in danger of sinking. The weather was bad, high winds, heavy rain, rough seas. But Alice and Sarah had flown in worse conditions many times. They took off from base with their full crew, confident in their abilities. The flight out to the vessel was challenging but manageable. They located the fishing boat and found 4 crew members waiting to be rescued. The rescue swimmer was deployed, and they began pulling the fishermen up one by one. The first 3 rescues went smoothly, but as they were preparing to lift the 4th fisherman, the weather suddenly worsened. Wind gusts increased dramatically, and the helicopter started getting hit by severe turbulence. Alice fought to keep the aircraft steady, but the conditions were deteriorating rapidly. Then, without warning, they were hit by a massive downdraft. The helicopter dropped suddenly, the engines screamed, and Alice pulled up with all her strength. But the aircraft was too low, too close to the water. The tail rotor struck the surface of a large wave. Everything happened in seconds. The helicopter spun violently. Alarms blared. Alice fought desperately to regain control, but the aircraft was damaged. They were going down. Alice managed to partially control the descent, preventing a complete crash. The helicopter hit the water hard, but stayed relatively upright. Emergency flotation devices deployed automatically. The crew began emergency procedures, evacuating the aircraft as it started to sink. Alice made sure every member of her crew got out. The rescue swimmer was safe. The flight mechanic was safe. The 3 rescued fishermen were safe. Sarah was trapped. In the chaos of the crash, Sarah's harness had jammed. She couldn't get free. Water was pouring into the aircraft. Alice stayed with her, desperately trying to release the jammed mechanism, but it wouldn't budge. The water was rising, the helicopter was sinking, and Sarah was looking at Alice with an expression that Alice would never forget. "Alice, you need to go," Sarah said, surprisingly calm despite the terror of the situation. "I'm not leaving you," Alice insisted, still fighting with the harness. "You have to," Sarah said. "If you stay, we both die. Go, Alice, please." But Alice wouldn't give up. She kept working on the harness, even as the water reached their chests, then their necks. She was screaming in frustration and fear, pulling at the mechanism with all her strength. Sarah grabbed Alice's face with both hands and forced her to make eye contact. "Listen to me," she said, water now reaching her chin. "You did everything right. This is not your fault, but you need to survive. Promise me you'll survive." "Sarah, please," Alice begged. "Promise me," Sarah insisted. The water was up to their mouths now. Alice knew she was out of time. If she stayed any longer, they would both drown. With tears streaming down her face, she made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She promised. And then she let go of Sarah and swam for the exit. Alice barely made it out before the helicopter sank completely. She surfaced, gasping and crying, and was pulled into a life raft by the flight mechanic. Another Coast Guard helicopter arrived within minutes and pulled everyone from the water. Everyone except Sarah. They searched for her body for 3 days, but she was never found. The ocean had taken her, and Alice's best friend was gone. The investigation into the crash concluded that Alice had done everything correctly. The accident was caused by a combination of extreme weather and mechanical failure. The tail rotor had struck the wave because a sudden downdraft pushed the helicopter down at the exact wrong moment. There was nothing Alice could have done to prevent it, but Alice didn't see it that way. She replayed that night over and over in her mind, analyzing every decision she had made, wondering if she could have done something differently. Maybe if she had climbed to a higher altitude earlier. Maybe if she had approached from a different angle. Maybe if she had been faster with the rescues. Maybe. The guilt was crushing. Sarah had died while Alice survived. Alice was the pilot in command. Everything that happened on that helicopter was ultimately her responsibility. And she had failed to protect her crew member, her best friend. The Coast Guard offered Alice counseling and time off to grieve. Her commanding officer told her that she was still one of the best pilots in the service and that they wanted her to continue flying. But Alice couldn't do it. Every time she thought about getting back in a helicopter, she felt panic rising in her chest. The thought of being responsible for another crew, of potentially failing them the way she felt she had failed Sarah, was unbearable. 6 months after the accident, Alice submitted her resignation. It shocked everyone who knew her. Storm Alice was retiring at 52, still at the peak of her career, still capable of years more service. People tried to talk her out of it. They told her she was making a mistake, that she was letting grief cloud her judgment, that she would regret leaving. But Alice was determined. She couldn't fly anymore. She couldn't be that person anymore. She needed to leave behind everything that reminded her of Sarah and the life they had shared. After processing her retirement, Alice sold her house in San Francisco and bought a used car. She loaded everything she owned into that car and started driving north along the coast. She didn't have a destination in mind. She just drove, stopping in small towns along the way, looking for something. She didn't even know what. 3 weeks into her journey, she drove through Redwood Beach. Something about the small coastal town spoke to her. It was quiet, peaceful, and completely removed from her old life. Nobody here would know who Storm Alice was. Nobody would have expectations of her. She could just be nobody. She rented a small apartment above the hardware store and started looking for work. When she saw the Help Wanted sign at Ocean's Catch, she applied immediately. Maria hired her on the spot, impressed by Alice's professional manner and strong work ethic. The job was simple: take orders, serve food, clean tables. It required no special skills, carried no great responsibilities, and most importantly, put no lives at risk. For the first year in Redwood Beach, Alice barely spoke to anyone beyond what was necessary for work. She was polite but distant, friendly but not close. She was grieving Sarah, grieving her old life, trying to figure out who she was now that she wasn't a Coast Guard pilot. Slowly, gradually, she began to heal. The grief didn't disappear, but it became something she could live with. She started to engage more with the community. She joined the library. She attended church occasionally. She went to town festivals. People in Redwood Beach got to know her as Alice Morgan, the quiet server at Ocean's Catch, and they accepted her without question. But Alice never forgot who she had been. Late at night, she would sometimes lie awake and remember the feel of a helicopter's controls in her hands, the rush of a successful rescue, the satisfaction of saving lives. She missed it terribly. But she also knew she could never go back. That part of her life was over. Or so she thought. 15 years after Alice first arrived in Redwood Beach, life had settled into a comfortable routine. She was 67 now, a well-known and well-liked member of the community. The memories of her past life were still there, but they had faded somewhat, like old photographs left too long in the sun. It was early October, the time of year when the weather along the northern California coast could be unpredictable. Summer was ending, fall was beginning, and the transition between seasons often brought storms. Alice noticed the changing weather patterns during her morning walk along the harbor. The wind had a different quality to it, sharper and more insistent. The ocean had a restless look, with whitecaps visible even inside the protected harbor. Fishermen were checking their boats carefully, securing loose items, preparing for the possibility of rough weather. At Ocean's Catch that morning, the conversation among the customers was all about the weather. The local news had been talking about a storm system developing off the coast, possibly bringing high winds and heavy rain to the area within the next few days. "Doesn't look too serious," said Jack Sullivan, one of the older fishermen in town. Jack was 72, with weathered skin and sharp eyes that had seen thousands of sunrises over the ocean. "I've seen worse this time of year." "The forecast keeps changing," countered Marcus Chen, who fished with his cousin Dorothy's husband. Marcus was in his 40s, more cautious than Jack, but still experienced. "Yesterday they said it might miss us entirely. Today they're saying it could be pretty strong." "Weather forecasters don't know everything," Jack said dismissively. "I've been fishing these waters for 50 years. I can tell when a storm is really dangerous." Alice refilled their coffee cups and listened to the conversation without commenting. She knew that experienced fishermen often relied on their instincts and their knowledge of local conditions, sometimes more than they relied on official forecasts. Usually, that served them well. But sometimes, weather could surprise even the most experienced mariners. Tommy Reeves came into the restaurant and joined Jack and Marcus at their table. Tommy was planning to go out fishing with them the next day. "Are we still on for tomorrow morning?" Tommy asked. "My dad's worried about the weather forecast." "We're going," Jack said firmly. "The fish are running, and I'm not going to miss a good opportunity because of a maybe storm. We'll head out early, get a good catch, and be back before the weather turns." "If it turns," Marcus added. "Like Jack said, the forecast keeps changing." Tommy looked uncertain, but nodded. "Okay, I trust your judgment, Jack." Alice felt a flutter of unease in her stomach. She had seen this scenario play out before, experienced people underestimating a storm, confident in their ability to handle whatever nature threw at them. She wanted to say something, to warn them, but she held her tongue. She wasn't a fisherman, she wasn't a meteorologist, and she certainly wasn't going to reveal her past experience to make a point. The day continued normally, but Alice couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. During her afternoon break, she walked to the harbor and looked out at the ocean. The sky was clouding over, and the wind was picking up. The water looked angry, choppy, and dark. Alice pulled out her phone, a simple flip phone that she used only for basic calls and texts, and checked the weather forecast online. The National Weather Service had issued a small craft advisory for the next day, warning of winds up to 30 knots and seas of 8 to 12 feet. Not extreme by ocean standards, but certainly conditions that required respect and caution. She walked back to the restaurant, still feeling uneasy. That evening, the wind picked up even more. Alice could hear it whistling around the buildings as she worked. Several customers mentioned that the weather was worse than they had expected. After work, Alice walked home through streets that were nearly empty. The wind was strong enough now that she had to lean into it. Leaves and small debris blew past her. The streetlights swayed on their poles. In her apartment, Alice turned on the small television she rarely used and found a local news channel. The weather segment showed the storm system approaching the coast. The meteorologist explained that the storm was intensifying more quickly than they had initially predicted. Warnings were being upgraded. Coastal residents were being advised to prepare for significant wind and rain. Alice turned off the television and stood at her window, watching the storm clouds gather over the ocean. She thought about Jack, Marcus, and Tommy, planning to go out fishing in the morning. She wondered if they were watching the same forecast, if they were reconsidering their plans. But she did nothing. It wasn't her place to interfere. She was just a server at a restaurant. What did she know about fishing or ocean conditions? She pushed the worry aside and went to bed. She slept poorly that night. The wind rattled her windows and made the old building creak and groan. She dreamed of storms and sinking helicopters and Sarah's face as the water rose around them. She woke up several times, heart pounding, before finally giving up on sleep around 5 in the morning. Alice made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, listening to the wind. It was still dark outside, but she could see the streetlights swaying wildly. This was going to be a significant storm. At 6:30, she got dressed and headed to work. The streets were wet from rain that had started during the night, and the wind was fierce. Alice had to hold on to her jacket to keep it from blowing open. Very few people were out at this early hour. When she arrived at Ocean's Catch, Maria was already there, looking worried. "This storm is worse than they predicted," Maria said. "I'm thinking about closing for the day. I don't think we'll have many customers in this weather." "That's probably wise," Alice agreed. They spent the next hour preparing the restaurant just in case customers did come in, but the dining room remained empty. The wind howled outside, and rain lashed against the windows. By 8 o'clock, Maria made the decision to close for the day. "Go home, Alice," Maria said. "There's no point in both of us sitting here when nobody's coming." Alice agreed and prepared to leave. But as she was putting on her jacket, she looked out the restaurant window toward the harbor. Through the rain and wind, she could see boats tossing wildly in the rough water. Most were securely tied to their docks, but she thought she saw movement near one of the larger fishing boats. Surely nobody was foolish enough to go out in this weather. But Alice felt a cold dread in her stomach. She remembered Jack's confident dismissal of the weather forecast. She remembered Tommy's trust in Jack's judgment. And she knew that sometimes experienced people made catastrophic errors in judgment. "Maria," Alice said slowly, "did Jack Sullivan and his crew go out this morning?" Maria looked out the window and frowned. "I don't know. Let me call my cousin. He would know." Maria pulled out her phone and made a call. Alice waited, her sense of dread growing. The wind was screaming now, and she could see waves breaking over the harbor breakwater. Maria's face went pale as she listened to whoever was on the other end of the line. "Are you sure?" she asked. "When did they leave?" She listened for another moment, then said, "Thank you," and ended the call. "They went out an hour ago," Maria said, her voice shaking. "Jack, Marcus, and Tommy. Jack insisted the storm wasn't as bad as the forecast said. They were going to get an early catch and be back before noon." Alice's professional instincts immediately kicked in. Have they reported any problems? Nobody's heard from them since they left the harbor, Maria said. My cousin tried to radio them a few minutes ago, but there was no response. He's worried. Alice walked to the window and looked out at the violent ocean. This was no ordinary coastal storm. This was serious weather, with high winds and dangerous seas. A fishing boat out in those conditions would be in real trouble. Call the Coast Guard, Alice said firmly. Report that the boat is overdue and not responding to radio calls. Don't you think we should wait a little longer? Maria asked. Maybe their radio is broken. Maybe they're just... Call the Coast Guard now, Alice interrupted, her voice commanding in a way that made Maria look at her in surprise. Every minute could matter. Maria made the call. Alice listened as Maria explained the situation to the Coast Guard dispatcher. When Maria hung up, she looked even more worried. They said they'll send a rescue boat, but it will take at least 45 minutes to get here from their station, Maria reported. The seas are rough, so it might take longer. Alice did quick calculations in her head. The fishing boat had left an hour ago. In good conditions, they would have traveled maybe 10 to 15 miles from shore by now. But in these conditions, they might not have gotten that far. Or they might have tried to turn back and run into trouble. 45 minutes for the Coast Guard to arrive. Then however long it took them to search in terrible visibility and rough seas. If the fishing boat was in serious trouble, that might be too long. Alice stood at the window, watching the storm, her mind racing. She wasn't a Coast Guard pilot anymore. She was 67 years old, a restaurant server with no authority and no resources. This wasn't her problem to solve. But 3 men were out there in a storm, possibly in danger. And Alice knew, she knew, that every minute counted in a maritime emergency. She thought of Sarah, trapped and drowning while Alice had been unable to save her. She thought of all the people she had saved during her 25 years with the Coast Guard. She thought of the oath she had taken, the commitment she had made to saving lives. Could she just stand here and do nothing? Alice's hands were shaking. She gripped the windowsill to steady them, her knuckles turning white. The familiar tightness in her chest was back, the feeling she always got when she thought about that night, about Sarah, about the water rising and the helicopter sinking. Alice? Maria's voice seemed to come from far away. Are you okay? You look pale. Alice forced herself to take a deep breath. I'm fine, she said, though it wasn't true. Maria, I need to go. Go? Go where? Alice, you can't go out in this weather. But Alice was already moving toward the door. I'll explain later, she said. She stepped out into the storm and immediately had to brace herself against the wind. Rain pelted her face, and within seconds she was soaked. But she didn't care. She had made a decision, and she wasn't going to second-guess it. Alice ran toward the harbor, her mind already formulating a plan. She needed a boat, a fast boat that could handle rough seas. She needed communication equipment. She needed people who could help, and she needed to move fast. The harbor was chaotic. Waves crashed over the breakwater, sending spray high into the air. Boats strained against their mooring lines, rocking violently. Several people were on the docks, frantically trying to secure equipment and protect their vessels. Alice spotted Robert Chen, Marcus's cousin and an experienced sailor, trying to add extra lines to his sport fishing boat. "Robert!" she shouted over the wind. Robert looked up, surprised to see her. "Alice, you shouldn't be out here. It's dangerous." "I need your boat," Alice said without preamble. Robert stared at her like she was crazy. "What? No way! Nobody should be going out in this." "Marcus, Jack, and Tommy are out there," Alice said firmly. "They're not responding to radio calls. The Coast Guard is coming, but they're 45 minutes away. Those men might not have 45 minutes. Alice, I understand you're worried, but we have to let the professionals handle this." I am a professional, Alice shouted, surprising both Robert and herself. Or I was. I was a Coast Guard helicopter pilot for 25 years. I've flown in storms worse than this. I've saved hundreds of lives. And I'm telling you that if those men are in trouble, we might be their best chance. Robert's mouth fell open. You were Coast Guard? Yes, Alice said. And I need your boat. Will you help me or not? Robert hesitated for only a second before nodding. The boat's fueled and ready, but Alice, even if you were Coast Guard, you're 67 years old. How can you— Age doesn't matter right now, Alice said. Knowledge and experience do. Do you have life jackets on board? Yes, of course. Radio equipment? Yes. Medical supplies? Basic first aid kit. It'll have to do, Alice said. Get on board. We're leaving now. Wait! A voice called out. Alice turned to see Danny Morrison, a young man in his early 20s who worked at the marina. I heard what you said. I'm coming with you. You'll need extra hands. This is going to be dangerous, Alice warned him. I know, Danny said, but those are our people out there. I'm not letting you go alone. Within 5 minutes, 2 more volunteers had joined them. Sarah Park, Jennifer's daughter who was an EMT, and Miguel Santos, Carlos's son who had marine rescue training. Alice looked at her impromptu crew with a mixture of gratitude and concern. They were brave, but none of them had experience with this kind of emergency. Listen to me carefully, Alice said, her voice taking on the command tone she hadn't used in 15 years. This is not going to be easy. The seas are rough, visibility is poor, and we don't know what condition that fishing boat is in. You need to follow my instructions exactly, without question. If I tell you to do something, you do it immediately. Lives may depend on it. Does everyone understand? They all nodded, their faces serious. Good, Alice said. Let's go. They boarded Robert's boat, a 40-foot sport fishing vessel with a flying bridge and good engines. It was a solid boat, well-maintained and capable, but it wasn't designed for storm conditions. This was going to test both the boat and everyone on board. Alice climbed to the flying bridge where the controls were located. Robert started to follow her, but she stopped him. I need you below, Alice said. Monitor the radio, keep watch for the fishing boat, and be ready to help with rescue operations. But you can't pilot the boat from up there in this weather. Yes, I can, Alice said with absolute confidence. Trust me. Robert looked uncertain, but nodded and went below. Alice sat in the captain's chair and put her hands on the wheel. It had been 15 years since she had piloted any kind of vessel, but the feel of it was immediately familiar. Not the same as a helicopter, but similar enough. A vehicle, controls, the need to read conditions and make instant decisions. She started the engines and felt them rumble to life. The boat rocked violently in the rough water of the harbor. Alice took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and eased the throttle forward. As they left the relative protection of the harbor and entered the open ocean, the full force of the storm hit them. Waves that had looked big from shore were enormous from the boat. Wind screamed across the water, tearing the tops off waves and sending spray everywhere. Rain lashed down so hard that visibility was reduced to a few hundred feet. Alice gripped the wheel tightly and focused every bit of her skill and experience on keeping the boat on course. She had to read the waves, timing their approach so that the boat took them at the right angle. Too perpendicular, and they risked capsizing. Too parallel, and they would get swamped by breaking waves. It was exhausting work. Every muscle in Alice's body was tense, her hands fighting the wheel constantly, her eyes scanning the water ahead for the next set of waves. She could feel the adrenaline coursing through her veins, that familiar rush that she had experienced so many times during Coast Guard missions. But she also felt fear. Real, gut-wrenching fear. Not for herself, but for the people on this boat who were trusting her to keep them safe, for the fishermen somewhere out there in this maelstrom, for everyone whose lives now depended on her decisions. "Alice," Robert's voice came through the intercom. "We're getting tossed around pretty badly down here. Are you sure you can handle this?" "I'm sure," Alice said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "How's everyone doing?" "Danny's looking a little green, but everyone else is okay. Sarah has the medical kit ready." "Good," Alice said. "Keep monitoring all radio channels. If that fishing boat is out here, they might be trying to call for help." Alice steered the boat northwest, based on her estimate of where the fishing boat might have gone. Jack usually fished a particular area about 12 miles offshore, where the underwater geography created good conditions for certain types of fish. In good weather, it was a 30-minute trip from the harbor. In these conditions, it would take longer. The boat climbed up one huge wave and crashed down the other side, sending shudders through the hull. Alice's arms ached from fighting the wheel, but she didn't let up. She was in the zone now, that state of intense focus that she remembered from her Coast Guard days. Everything else faded away. The fear, the doubt, the memories. There was only the ocean, the boat, and the mission. 20 minutes into the journey, Robert's voice came over the intercom again. "Alice, we're picking up a faint signal on the emergency channel. It's breaking up, but I think it's them." "What are they saying?" Alice demanded. "Something about taking on water. Can't keep breaking up too much to make out clearly." Alice's blood ran cold. Taking on water. That meant the boat was sinking. They had to find them fast. "Can you get a direction on the signal?" Alice asked. "Our equipment isn't that sophisticated," Robert said, "but it seemed slightly stronger when we were heading north-northwest." "Okay," Alice said. "I'm adjusting course. Everyone hold on." She turned the wheel slightly, angling more to the northwest. The change in direction meant taking the waves at a different angle, and the boat rolled heavily. Alice heard things crashing around below deck, and someone, probably Danny, crying out. But Alice kept the new course. Her instincts, honed by years of experience, told her this was the right direction. She scanned the horizon constantly, looking for any sign of the fishing boat. But visibility was terrible, and the rain and spray made it almost impossible to see more than a few hundred yards. "Come on," Alice muttered to herself. "Where are you?" As if in answer, Robert's voice came over the intercom, urgent and excited. "Alice, I see them, about 500 yards ahead, maybe 30 degrees to port." Alice immediately spotted what Robert had seen, a dark shape rising and falling in the waves. As they got closer, she could make out more details. It was Jack's fishing boat, the Seahawk, and it was in serious trouble. The boat was listing heavily to one side, sitting low in the water. Waves were breaking over the deck. Alice could see figures moving on board, at least 2, maybe 3 people. They were still alive, but the boat was clearly sinking. Alice's mind went into tactical mode, assessing the situation with professional detachment. The fishing boat was too large to pull onto Robert's boat. They would need to transfer the fishermen over manually. In these seas, bringing the 2 boats alongside each other was going to be extremely dangerous. If they collided too hard, both boats could be damaged. If they couldn't hold position, someone could fall into the water between the vessels and be crushed. But there was no choice. This had to be done. Alice picked up the radio microphone. "Seahawk, this is the rescue boat. Do you read me?" There was a crackle of static, then Jack's voice, strained and frightened. "Rescue boat, we read you. Thank God. We're taking on water fast. The hull is breached. We're going to sink." "Understood, Seahawk," Alice said, keeping her voice calm and professional. "We're going to come alongside and transfer your crew. How many people on board?" "3," Jack responded. Me, Marcus, and Tommy. We're all injured but mobile. Okay, Alice said. Listen carefully. We're going to approach your starboard side. When I get close, I need you to throw us a line so we can keep the boats together. Then you're going to jump to our boat one at a time. Do you understand? Yes, Jack said. But the seas are rough. I don't know if we can. You can and you will, Alice interrupted firmly. I've done this before in worse conditions. Trust me, and follow my instructions exactly. Lives depend on it. There was a pause, then Jack said, Who is this? A friend, Alice said. Now get ready. We're coming in. Alice handed the wheel over to Robert with explicit instructions. I'm going down to coordinate the rescue. Hold this course and this speed. When I give you the signal, bring us alongside the Seahawk's starboard side, about 10 feet away. Not too close, not too far. Can you do that? Robert's face was pale, but he nodded. I'll do my best. Your best will be good enough, Alice assured him. Then she climbed down from the flying bridge. Below deck, the scene was chaotic. The boat was pitching and rolling violently. Danny was leaning over a bucket, clearly seasick. Sarah and Miguel were bracing themselves against the bulkheads, trying to stay upright. Listen up, Alice shouted over the noise of the storm. We're about to attempt a rescue. This is going to be dangerous, and I need everyone to follow my instructions exactly. Sarah, I need you standing by with the medical kit in case anyone is injured. Miguel, you're going to help me pull the fishermen aboard. Danny, even if you're sick, I need you to help secure lines. Can you do that? Danny wiped his mouth and nodded weakly. I'll try. Not try. Do, Alice said firmly. People are counting on us. She moved to the side of the boat and looked out at the Seahawk. They were closer now, close enough that she could see the 3 fishermen clearly. Jack was at the wheel, fighting to keep his sinking boat stable. Marcus was on deck, holding onto the gunwale to keep from being washed overboard. Tommy was trying to bail water with a bucket, a futile effort given the size of the breach in the hull. Alice assessed the situation with her experienced eye. The Seahawk was settling deeper into the water with each wave. They had maybe 10 minutes before it sank completely. The rescue had to happen fast. She picked up a megaphone and called out to the fishermen. Seahawk crew, I'm going to count down from 3. On my mark, Marcus, I need you to throw us your bowline. Do you understand? Marcus looked up and nodded. He grabbed a coiled rope from the deck. 3, 2, 1, throw! Marcus threw the line with all his strength. The wind caught it and blew it off course, but Miguel managed to grab the end before it fell into the water. He quickly secured it to a cleat on Robert's boat. Good! Alice shouted. Now the stern line. Same thing. Ready? 3, 2, 1, throw! This time the throw was better. Danny, fighting his seasickness, caught the line and secured it. Now the 2 boats were loosely connected, rising and falling with the waves, but staying relatively close together. Alice could see that the gap between the boats was about 8 feet, close enough to jump, but dangerous in these conditions. If someone mistimed their jump, they could fall into the churning water between the vessels and be crushed. Okay, Alice shouted through the megaphone. Tommy, you're coming first. When I say jump, you jump. Don't think about it. Don't hesitate. Just jump. Miguel and I will catch you. Ready? Tommy stood at the edge of the Seahawk's deck, looking terrified. He was young and strong, but Alice could see the fear in his eyes. The boats were pitching wildly, sometimes coming close together, sometimes separating. Alice watched the waves, timing their rhythm. She needed to call for the jump when both boats were at the same height and as close together as possible. It required perfect timing. She waited, watching the wave pattern. One wave passed. The boats rose and fell. Another wave. The pattern was starting to make sense to her. She could predict it now. Get ready, Alice called. Get ready, now. Jump! Tommy jumped. For a heart-stopping moment, he was airborne over the churning water. Then he landed heavily on the deck of Robert's boat. Miguel caught him and pulled him to safety. Good, Alice shouted. One down. Marcus, you're next. Same procedure. Marcus was older and not as athletic as Tommy, but he positioned himself at the edge of the Seahawk's deck and prepared to jump. Alice could see him breathing heavily, psyching himself up for the leap. Again, Alice watched the waves, timing the rhythm. The boats pitched and rolled. The gap between them opened and closed like a mouth. Ready? Alice called. Ready? Now! Jump! Marcus jumped, but his timing was slightly off. He didn't push off as hard as Tommy had, and for a terrible moment, it looked like he wasn't going to make it. Alice lunged forward and grabbed his jacket, pulling him toward the boat. Miguel grabbed his other arm, and together they hauled him aboard. Marcus collapsed on the deck, breathing hard. Thank you, he gasped. Thank you. We're not done yet, Alice said. 2 down, 1 to go. Jack, you're last. Leave the wheel and get ready to jump. Through the rain and spray, Alice could see Jack hesitating at the Seahawk's wheel. She understood his reluctance. A captain leaving his vessel, even a sinking one, went against every instinct. But there was no time for sentiment. Jack! Alice shouted. The boat is lost! Save yourself! Now! Jack finally left the wheel and moved to the edge of the deck. But at that moment, a huge wave struck the Seahawk broadside. The fishing boat lurched violently, and Jack lost his balance. He fell, hitting his head on the gunwale before tumbling onto the deck. Jack! Marcus screamed. Alice's heart sank. Jack wasn't moving. He was lying on the deck of the sinking boat, possibly unconscious, possibly seriously injured. And the Seahawk was settling lower in the water, the ocean pouring into the breached hull. They had maybe 5 minutes before the boat sank completely. Alice made a decision. Miguel, take over here. Sarah, get your medical kit ready. I'm going over. What? Miguel said. Alice, you can't. But Alice was already moving. At 67, she wasn't as agile as she once was, but adrenaline and muscle memory took over. She grabbed a life jacket, secured it quickly, and positioned herself at the edge of the boat. She watched the wave pattern, timing the moment. The boats rose and fell. The gap closed. Now! She shouted to herself, and jumped. Alice's feet hit the deck of the Seahawk hard, and she almost lost her balance. But she caught herself on the gunwale and stayed upright. Water swirled around her ankles. The deck was already partially flooded. She rushed to where Jack was lying. He was breathing but unconscious, blood running from a gash on his forehead. Alice quickly assessed him for other injuries. His pupils responded to light. Good. His breathing was steady. Good. But he was dead weight, and she needed to get him off this sinking boat. Miguel! Alice shouted across the gap. I'm going to lift Jack up. You need to grab him and pull him over. Can you do that? I'll try, Miguel shouted back. Alice hooked her arms under Jack's shoulders and dragged him to the edge of the boat. He was heavy, much heavier than she had anticipated. At 67, Alice didn't have the strength she once had. Her arms trembled with the effort of holding him up, but she couldn't fail. Not now. Not when they were so close. She thought of Sarah, trapped in the sinking helicopter. She thought of all the people she had saved during her career. She thought of the promise she had made to survive, to keep going, to keep helping. With a surge of effort that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her, Alice lifted Jack's unconscious body and held him up at the edge of the boat. Now! She screamed. Take him now! Miguel reached across the gap and grabbed Jack's jacket. With Tommy's help, they pulled him across and onto the safety of Robert's boat. Jack was safe. But Alice was still on the Seahawk, and it was sinking fast. Water was now flooding across the deck of the Seahawk, and Alice could feel the boat shifting beneath her feet. It was going down, and it was going down fast. She had maybe 60 seconds before it sank completely. Alice looked at the gap between the boats. It was wider now, about 10 feet. The boats were being pushed apart by the waves, too far to jump safely, especially for a 67-year-old woman who had just exhausted herself lifting an unconscious man. "Alice!" It was Robert's voice, panicked. "The lines are breaking. We're drifting apart." Alice could see the bowline fraying under the strain. When it snapped, the boats would separate completely, and she would be trapped on a sinking vessel in the middle of a storm. She had two options. She could try to jump now, risking a fall into the churning water, or she could wait and hope that Robert could bring his boat back alongside before the Seahawk sank completely. Alice's instincts told her to jump, but her body was telling her something else, that she was tired, that her muscles were shaking from exertion, that she might not make it. For the first time in her life, Alice felt the full weight of her age. She wasn't the young, strong Coast Guard pilot anymore. She was an older woman who had just pushed her body to its limits. The bowline snapped with a sound like a gunshot. "Alice!" Multiple voices screamed her name. The boats were drifting apart rapidly now. The gap was 12 feet, 15 feet, too far to jump. Alice looked down at the water swirling around her knees on the sinking deck. So this was it. This was how it would end. Not in a helicopter crash 15 years ago, but here, now, on a sinking fishing boat in a storm. She thought about Sarah. Maybe she would finally get to tell her friend that she was sorry, that she had tried to save her, that she had never forgotten her. But then Alice heard another sound over the howling wind and crashing waves. It was a helicopter. She looked up and saw it. A Coast Guard rescue helicopter flying low over the ocean, fighting the storm just like she used to do. It had arrived. The helicopter positioned itself above the sinking Seahawk. A rescue swimmer was being lowered on a cable, descending toward Alice through the wind and rain. Alice almost laughed. After all these years, after everything she had been through, she was being rescued by the Coast Guard. The irony was almost too much. The rescue swimmer landed on the deck beside her, water splashing up around his boots. He was young, maybe 30, with determined eyes visible through his helmet visor. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me," he shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "The boat is sinking." "I know it's sinking," Alice shouted back. "I used to do your job." The swimmer looked confused, but there was no time for explanations. He helped Alice into a rescue harness and gave the signal to the helicopter crew. The winch began pulling them up. As they rose into the air, Alice looked down and saw the Seahawk finally surrender to the ocean. The fishing boat tipped, rolled, and slid beneath the waves. In seconds, it was gone, swallowed by the storm. But the men who had been on that boat were safe. Tommy, Marcus, and Jack were on Robert's boat, heading back to harbor with Miguel, Danny, and Sarah. They were alive because of the rescue operation that Alice had led. She had done it. Despite her age, despite her fears, despite everything, she had done it. The helicopter crew pulled Alice and the rescue swimmer into the aircraft. As soon as they were safely inside, the helicopter turned and headed back toward shore. Alice sat in the crew compartment, dripping wet and exhausted. One of the crew members, a young woman who reminded Alice of herself at that age, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. "That was incredibly brave, ma'am," the crew member said, "and incredibly dangerous. You shouldn't have gone out in this storm." Alice managed a tired smile. "I had no choice," she said. "Those men needed help." The crew member studied Alice's face for a moment. "You look familiar," she said. Have we met before? I don't think so, Alice said, but the crew member was still looking at her intently. Wait a minute. Are you... No, it can't be. Are you Alice Morgan? Storm Alice? Alice felt her heart skip a beat. How do you know that name? Every Coast Guard pilot knows that name, the crew member said, her eyes wide. You're a legend. They still teach your rescue techniques at the academy. But everyone thought you retired years ago. What are you doing here? Alice didn't answer. She just pulled the blanket tighter around herself and looked out the window at the storm. The helicopter landed at the Coast Guard station, where an ambulance was waiting. The paramedics wanted to check Alice for hypothermia and exhaustion, but she waved them off. Check the fisherman first, she insisted, especially Jack Sullivan. He hit his head and was unconscious. Ma'am, we need to make sure you're okay, too. I'm fine, Alice said firmly. I'm cold and tired, but I'm fine. Those men are your priority. She learned that Robert's boat had made it safely back to Redwood Beach Harbor just minutes before the helicopter landed. The fisherman had been taken to the local medical clinic for evaluation. Jack had regained consciousness during the trip back and was expected to be okay, though he had a concussion and would need to be monitored. Alice was eventually convinced to let the paramedics do a quick examination. They confirmed that she was suffering from mild hypothermia and exhaustion, but nothing serious. They wanted to take her to the hospital anyway, but Alice refused. I just want to go home, she said. The Coast Guard offered to drive her back to Redwood Beach. As Alice sat in the back of the vehicle, watching the storm rage outside, she felt oddly calm. She had done something today that she thought she would never do again. She had saved lives. When they arrived in Redwood Beach, Alice was surprised to see a crowd gathered at the harbor despite the bad weather. News of the rescue had apparently spread quickly through the small town. When Alice stepped out of the Coast Guard vehicle, people started clapping. Alice felt overwhelmed. She wasn't used to this kind of attention. For 15 years, she had been invisible, just another face in the community. Now everyone was staring at her, applauding, calling out her name. Maria pushed through the crowd and threw her arms around Alice. You're alive! Thank God! When you ran out into the storm, I was so worried. I'm okay, Maria, Alice said quietly. Okay? You're a hero, Maria said. You saved 3 lives. Tommy Reeves appeared, his arm in a sling but otherwise looking healthy. Miss Morgan, he said, his voice choked with emotion. You saved my life. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Alice said. I'm just glad you're safe. Marcus Chen came forward next. The Coast Guard told us what you did, how you jumped onto the sinking boat to save Jack, how you used to be one of them. All these years, we never knew. I didn't want anyone to know, Alice said simply. Jack Sullivan was there too, his head bandaged, but his eyes clear. He looked at Alice with an expression of deep respect and gratitude. I was wrong about the storm, he said. I made a stupid, arrogant decision, and it almost got us all killed. You had every right to let me face the consequences of my mistake, but you didn't. You risked your life to save mine. Why? Alice met his eyes. Because that's what you do, she said. When someone needs help, you help them. It's that simple. Pastor Michael Stevens stepped forward. Alice, I think the whole town would like to know your story, who you really are, what you did before you came here. Alice looked around at all the faces watching her, people she had served at the restaurant, people she had chatted with on the street, people she had lived among for 15 years without them knowing the truth about her. She took a deep breath. Okay, she said. I'll tell you my story. They gathered in the community center, out of the storm. It seemed like half the town was there, crowded into the large room, all wanting to hear Alice's story. She stood at the front, still wearing her wet clothes, feeling more exposed than she had felt in years. My name is Alice Morgan, she began. And before I came to Redwood Beach, I was a helicopter pilot for the United States Coast Guard. She told them everything about joining the Coast Guard at 22, about her training and her first assignments, about becoming one of the first female aircraft commanders, about her partnership with Sarah Mitchell, about the hundreds of rescues they had performed together over 25 years. She told them about the storms she had flown through, the people she had saved, the awards and commendations she had received, about her nickname, Storm Alice, and why she had earned it. And then, with tears running down her face, she told them about the night Sarah died, about the accident, the sinking helicopter, the impossible choice she had been forced to make, about leaving her best friend to drown because staying would have meant they both died. The room was completely silent. People were crying, even some of the tough fishermen who thought they had seen everything. I couldn't fly anymore after that, Alice continued. I couldn't be responsible for other people's lives. I couldn't face the possibility of failing again, of losing someone else. So I left the Coast Guard. I left everything behind and came here, to Redwood Beach, looking for a simple life where I wouldn't have to be brave anymore. She paused and looked around the room at all the familiar faces. I thought I could leave that part of myself behind, she said. I thought I could just be normal, ordinary, invisible. And for 15 years, that's what I was. You all accepted me without questions, without expectations. You gave me peace. But today, when I heard that Jack, Marcus, and Tommy were in trouble, I realized something. You can't leave behind who you really are. I'm a Coast Guard pilot. Or I was. That training, that experience, those instincts, they're part of me. Even at 67, even after 15 years away, I'm still that person. So I made a choice. I could stay safe and let someone else handle the emergency. Or I could use my skills to help. And I chose to help, even though I was terrified, even though I thought I might fail, even though I'm not young anymore, and my body can't do everything it used to do. Alice's voice grew stronger. And you know what? We succeeded. Yes, the Coast Guard helicopter arrived at the end and pulled me off the sinking boat. But before they got there, we had already rescued 3 men from a vessel that would have taken them to the bottom of the ocean. We did that. Me, Robert, Danny, Miguel, and Sarah. Regular people from this town, working together, saving lives. She looked directly at the crowd. I'm sorry I kept my past a secret from you all. I was trying to protect myself, to hide from my grief and my guilt. But secrets have a cost. They keep us isolated. They prevent real connections. You deserve to know who I really was. Maria stood up. Alice, you don't owe us any apologies. We're just grateful you were here today, that you had the skills and courage to help when help was needed. That's right, said Dorothy Chen. You saved my cousin's life. You saved Tommy and Jack. You're a hero, Alice. I'm not a hero, Alice said. I'm just someone who did what needed to be done. The real heroes are the people who put on that Coast Guard uniform every day and go out into storms because it's their job, because someone needs help. I used to be one of them. Today, I was just trying to do the right thing. Robert Chen stood up. Alice, you commanded that rescue operation like a professional. You knew exactly what to do, how to approach the sinking boat, how to time the rescue. Without your expertise, I don't think we could have pulled it off. You may have retired from the Coast Guard, but you're still Storm Alice. You'll always be Storm Alice. The crowd erupted in applause. Alice felt tears streaming down her face, but this time they were tears of release, of relief. She had carried the weight of her secret for so long, and now it was out in the open. These people knew who she really was, and they were accepting her anyway. After the gathering, people came up to Alice one by one. Some wanted to shake her hand. Some wanted to hug her. Some just wanted to say thank you. She was emotionally exhausted by the time the last person left. Maria drove Alice back to her apartment. As they pulled up outside the hardware store, Maria turned to her. "Are you going to stay?" Maria asked. "In Redwood Beach, I mean. Now that everyone knows your past, are you going to stay?" Alice thought about the question. She could leave, start over somewhere else, try once again to hide from her past. But she was tired of hiding, and she realized that this town, these people, they had become her home. "Yes," Alice said. "I'm staying, if you'll have me at the restaurant still." Maria laughed. "Are you kidding? You're the most famous person in Redwood Beach now. Ocean's Catch is going to be packed with people wanting to meet the legendary Storm Alice." "Oh, God," Alice said, covering her face with her hands. "I didn't think about that." "Don't worry," Maria assured her. "The novelty will wear off. Eventually, you'll just be Alice again. But Alice as we really know you now. All of you, not just the parts you chose to show us." Alice smiled. "Thank you, Maria, for everything." She climbed the stairs to her apartment, her body aching with fatigue. She took a hot shower, put on dry clothes, and made herself a cup of tea. Then she sat in her living room, looking around at the space that had been her sanctuary for so long. Everything looked the same, but everything felt different. She was different. Today, she had been tested in ways she hadn't been tested in 15 years. And she had passed that test. She had saved lives. She had faced her fears and her trauma, and she had come through it. Alice walked to her bedroom closet and pulled down the cardboard box from the top shelf. She opened it and looked at the contents, the photographs, the medals, the memories. For 15 years, these items had represented a life she had lost, a person she could no longer be. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe she had never lost that person. Maybe Storm Alice had just been sleeping, waiting for the moment when she would be needed again. Alice took out the photograph of herself and Sarah, the one that had always been too painful to look at. She studied Sarah's smiling face, remembering her laugh, her courage, her friendship. "I did it, Sarah," Alice whispered to the photograph. "I saved them. I was so scared, but I did it anyway, just like you would have done." She felt a sense of peace settle over her, different from the peace she had found in hiding. This was the peace of acceptance, of understanding that the past couldn't be changed, but could be honored. Sarah was gone, and that would always hurt. But Sarah wouldn't have wanted Alice to spend the rest of her life hiding from who she was. Alice placed the photograph on her bookshelf, where she could see it every day. Then she put the rest of the box's contents away and went to bed. She slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in years. The storm passed during the night, and Alice woke to sunshine streaming through her window. Her body ached in ways it hadn't ached in years. Her arms were sore from fighting the boat's wheel, her legs were stiff from bracing against the pitching deck, and she had bruises she couldn't remember getting. But she felt more alive than she had felt in a very long time. Alice got up slowly, made coffee, and stood at her window looking out at Redwood Beach. The streets were littered with debris from the storm, tree branches, trash, a few roof shingles. But the sky was clear and blue, and the ocean looked peaceful, as if yesterday's violence had never happened. Her phone rang. Alice looked at it in surprise. Very few people had her number. She answered to find it was Captain Jennifer Hayes from the Coast Guard station. "Ms. Morgan, I hope I'm not calling too early," Captain Hayes said. "I wanted to check on how you're feeling today." "Sore but alive," Alice said. "How are the fishermen?" "All doing well. Jack Sullivan has a concussion and some bruised ribs, but he'll make a full recovery. The other two had minor injuries. They're all being released from the hospital this morning." "That's good to hear," Alice said, feeling relief wash over her. "Ms. Morgan, I also wanted to talk to you about yesterday's rescue operation," Captain Hayes continued. "The official report credits the Coast Guard with the rescue, since our helicopter was on scene. But I know the real story. By the time we arrived, you had already gotten 3 men off a sinking boat in terrible conditions. That was an extraordinary piece of seamanship and leadership." "I had help," Alice said. "Robert, Danny, Miguel, and Sarah. They were brave and did exactly what I asked of them. Even so, your experience and decision-making were critical," Captain Hayes said. "I've read your service record, Commander Morgan. It's impressive. 25 years, hundreds of successful missions, multiple commendations for valor. Why did you leave?" Alice was quiet for a moment. "I lost someone," she finally said. "My co-pilot and best friend, in an accident during a rescue. I couldn't continue after that." "I understand," Captain Hayes said gently. "I lost a crew member 3 years ago. It's the hardest thing about this job, knowing that we can't save everyone, even when we do everything right." They talked for a few more minutes, and Captain Hayes mentioned that the Coast Guard might want to interview Alice for their training programs, to have her share her experiences with new pilots. Alice said she would think about it. After the call ended, Alice got dressed and headed to Ocean's Catch. Despite it being a Sunday morning, she felt the need to check in, to make sure everything was okay, to return to her normal routine. When she arrived at the restaurant, she found a crowd of people waiting outside. As soon as they saw her, they started clapping and calling out greetings. Alice felt her face flush with embarrassment. "Is it always going to be like this?" she asked Maria, who was opening the restaurant for the day. "Probably for a while," Maria said with a grin. "You're famous now, Alice. You'd better get used to it." The restaurant was packed all day. People came not just for the food, but to see Alice, to talk to her, to hear about the rescue. Some were from Redwood Beach, but others had driven from neighboring towns after seeing the news reports about the retired Coast Guard pilot who had saved 3 fishermen. Alice found herself telling the story over and over again. At first, it was exhausting and uncomfortable. But as the day went on, she realized that sharing the story was actually helping her. Each time she told it, the events became a little less traumatic, a little more like something that had happened rather than something that was still happening to her. During a brief lull in the afternoon, Alice saw Jack Sullivan come into the restaurant. He had a bandage on his head and moved carefully, but he was walking on his own. He spotted Alice and came over to her table. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Of course," Alice said. "Sit down." Jack settled into the chair across from her. "I wanted to apologize," he said, "for being arrogant about the storm, for putting myself and my crew in danger, for not listening to the forecasts. I've been fishing these waters for 50 years, and I thought I knew better than some weatherman. I was wrong, and it almost cost us our lives." "We all make mistakes," Alice said. "The important thing is that you learned from it." "I did," Jack said firmly. "I will never again ignore weather warnings, and I will never again think that experience makes me invincible." He paused. "But I also wanted to say thank you. You didn't have to risk your life for us. You could have waited for the Coast Guard. Instead, you came out in that storm and pulled us off that sinking boat. You saved my life, Alice. I owe you everything." "You don't owe me anything," Alice said. "I did what I was trained to do." "You did more than that," Jack insisted. "You jumped onto a sinking boat to pull me off when I was unconscious. At your age, with the conditions what they were, that took incredible courage." Alice smiled slightly. "At my age? I'm only 5 years older than you, Jack. Jack laughed. Fair point. But still, what you did was extraordinary. After Jack left, Tommy and Marcus came in together. They had similar messages of gratitude and respect. Alice appreciated their words, but she was also eager for life to return to normal. Over the next few weeks, the attention gradually diminished. People in Redwood Beach got used to knowing that Alice Morgan used to be Storm Alice, the legendary Coast Guard pilot. The story became part of the town's lore, something to tell visitors about. But something had fundamentally changed in Alice's life. She was no longer hiding from her past. The box of memories came down from the closet shelf, and its contents found places around her apartment. The photograph of Alice and Sarah sat on the bookshelf. A few medals were framed and hung on the wall. These weren't shameful secrets anymore. They were parts of her life that she could acknowledge and honor. Alice also started receiving calls and emails from the Coast Guard, from aviation safety organizations, and from search and rescue groups. They wanted her to speak at conferences, to conduct training sessions, to share her knowledge and experience. At first, Alice was hesitant, but she gradually realized that she had something valuable to offer. Lessons learned from 25 years of experience that could help train the next generation of rescue personnel. She agreed to conduct a few training sessions at the Coast Guard Academy. Standing in front of a classroom full of young pilots, Alice felt nervous at first. But as she started talking about weather assessment, decision-making under pressure, and rescue techniques, she found her confidence returning. These young people were eager to learn, and Alice discovered that she enjoyed teaching. One day, about 2 months after the rescue, Alice received a visitor at her apartment. It was a woman in her mid-40s with dark hair and Sarah Mitchell's eyes. "Ms. Morgan," the woman said, "my name is Jessica Mitchell. Sarah Mitchell was my mother." Alice felt her heart stop. "You're Sarah's daughter?" "Yes," Jessica said. "I've been wanting to meet you for years, but I didn't know where you were. When I saw the news about the rescue in Redwood Beach, I recognized your name. Can we talk?" They sat in Alice's small living room, and Jessica told her story. She had been 21 when her mother died, a college student who came home to find that her mother had been killed in a Coast Guard accident. For years, she had been angry at the Coast Guard, at the storm, at the helicopter, at everything that had taken her mother away. "But I was never angry at you," Jessica said. "I read the accident report. I know you tried to save her. I know you nearly died trying." "I should have saved her," Alice said, tears streaming down her face. "I was the pilot in command. I was responsible for my crew. I failed." Jessica took Alice's hands in hers. "You didn't fail. You were in an impossible situation. My mother knew the risks of her job. She chose to be a Coast Guard pilot because she wanted to save lives. She died doing what she loved, and she died knowing that you and the rest of the crew survived because she made you leave. She made me promise to survive," Alice whispered. "In those last moments, she made me promise." "Then you kept your promise," Jessica said. "You survived. And yesterday I read about how you saved 3 fishermen in a storm. You're still saving lives, Alice. My mother would be so proud of you." They talked for hours. Jessica told Alice about her life, about her 2 children, about her career as a teacher. She showed Alice photographs of her family, including pictures of Sarah as a young mother, smiling and happy. When Jessica finally left, she hugged Alice tightly. "Thank you for being my mother's friend," she said. "Thank you for trying to save her. And thank you for continuing to be the person she believed you were." After Jessica left, Alice sat in her living room for a long time, looking at the photograph of her and Sarah. For 15 years, she had carried the guilt and the pain of that night. But maybe it was time to add something else to those feelings. Gratitude for the years they had together, pride in what they had accomplished, an acceptance that some things are beyond anyone's control. Alice picked up the photograph and studied Sarah's smiling face. "I miss you, my friend," she said quietly, "but I'm going to be okay. I think I'm finally going to be okay." As autumn progressed into winter, Alice found herself busier than she had been in years. She still worked at Ocean's Catch. Maria had made it clear that Alice would always have a job there if she wanted it, but she was now also conducting regular training sessions for the Coast Guard and other rescue organizations. She traveled to the Coast Guard Academy in Connecticut to give a series of lectures on storm flying and decision-making under pressure. She conducted a workshop for helicopter pilots on risk assessment and crew resource management. She even participated in a panel discussion about the challenges faced by search and rescue personnel. At first, Alice worried that being around helicopters and Coast Guard personnel would trigger her PTSD, would bring back the panic and the nightmares. But the opposite happened. Being back in that environment, sharing her knowledge, and feeling connected to the mission of saving lives actually helped her heal. She was finally able to separate her grief over Sarah's death from her love of the work they had done together. In Redwood Beach, life had mostly returned to normal, though Alice noticed that people treated her with a new respect. When she walked down Main Street, people greeted her warmly. When she served customers at the restaurant, they chatted with her not just as a server, but as a person with an interesting history. One evening in December, Alice was closing up the restaurant when Robert Chen came in. He looked nervous, fidgeting with his baseball cap. "Alice, can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked. "Of course," Alice said. "What's on your mind?" Robert sat down at one of the tables. "I've been thinking about the rescue," he said, "about how you took command, how you knew exactly what to do, how you kept all of us calm and focused. And I realized something. I want to be able to do that. Not professionally necessarily, but I want to have those skills in case something like that ever happens again." "That's commendable," Alice said. "What exactly are you thinking?" "I want to organize a community emergency response team," Robert said. "People from Redwood Beach who can be trained in basic rescue techniques, first aid, emergency coordination. People who can help in situations like we had during the storm. And I was hoping, would you be willing to help train us?" Alice felt a warmth spread through her chest. "I think that's an excellent idea," she said. "And yes, I'd be happy to help." Over the next few months, Alice worked with Robert to establish the Redwood Beach Community Emergency Response Team. They recruited 20 volunteers from the town: fishermen, business owners, teachers, retirees, people from all walks of life who wanted to be prepared to help in an emergency. Alice designed a training program that covered basic maritime rescue, first aid, communication protocols, and emergency decision-making. She brought in guest instructors from the Coast Guard and local fire department. She organized practical exercises where the team practiced rescue scenarios. The training sessions became popular community events. People enjoyed learning new skills, and they appreciated Alice's patient, professional teaching style. Alice, in turn, found deep satisfaction in passing on her knowledge to a new generation. Danny Morrison, the young man who had volunteered to help with the fishing boat rescue despite his seasickness, became one of the most dedicated members of the team. Alice took him under her wing, mentoring him in maritime safety and rescue techniques. "You know," Danny said to Alice one day after a training session, "before the rescue, I was kind of drifting through life. I worked at the marina, but it was just a job. Now I feel like I have a purpose. I'm thinking about applying to the Coast Guard." "You should," Alice encouraged him. "You have good instincts and you're brave. You'd make an excellent Coast Guard rescue swimmer." "Will you write me a recommendation?" Danny asked hopefully. "I'd be honored to," Alice said. Sarah Park, the EMT who had been on the rescue boat, also became deeply involved in the community response team. She and Alice worked together to develop emergency medical protocols, specifically tailored to maritime situations. "I've learned more from you in 6 months than I learned in years of formal training," Sarah told Alice. "You have a gift for teaching, for making complex situations understandable." "I had good teachers," Alice said, thinking of her own instructors from decades ago. "I'm just passing on what they taught me." The community response team proved its value several times during the winter. When a small boat capsized in the harbor during a windstorm, team members were on scene within minutes, pulling the two occupants from the water and providing first aid until paramedics arrived. When a hiker fell on the coastal trail and broke his leg, team members coordinated the rescue and evacuation. Each time, Alice felt proud of how her students performed. But Alice's influence extended beyond Redwood Beach. A video of one of her training sessions, posted online by an enthusiastic student, went viral in the maritime rescue community. It showed Alice explaining storm assessment techniques with clarity and precision, illustrated with examples from her own experience. The video was shared thousands of times, and Alice started receiving requests for training from rescue organizations around the country. A documentary filmmaker contacted Alice, wanting to make a film about her life and career. At first, Alice declined, uncomfortable with that level of attention. But the filmmaker persisted, arguing that Alice's story of courage, loss, healing, and service could inspire others. "You represent something important," the filmmaker said. "You show that age doesn't define capability, that trauma doesn't have to be the end of a story, and that service to others can take many forms. Your story deserves to be told." After much consideration, Alice agreed to participate in the documentary. Over several weeks, she sat for interviews, revisited her old Coast Guard station, and allowed the filmmakers to document her work with the community response team in Redwood Beach. The most difficult part of the filming was when they visited Sarah's grave. Jessica Mitchell joined them, and together, Alice and Sarah's daughter stood before the memorial marker. "I spent so many years running from this," Alice said to the camera. "Running from the grief, the guilt, the memory of that night. But I've learned that you can't run from your past. You have to make peace with it. Sarah's death was a tragedy, but it doesn't diminish the 25 years we spent saving lives together. It doesn't erase all the good we did." The documentary, titled "Storm Alice: A Life of Service," premiered at a film festival and was later broadcast on public television. The response was overwhelming. Alice received thousands of letters and emails from people who had been inspired by her story. Young people considering careers in public service, older adults who felt they were too old to make a difference, trauma survivors who were struggling to move forward with their lives. One letter came from a woman named Patricia, who was 69 years old and had recently lost her husband. "I was ready to give up," Patricia wrote. "I thought my life was over, that there was nothing left for me. But your story showed me that it's never too late to find purpose, to use your skills and experience to help others. Thank you for that gift." Alice responded to as many letters as she could, offering encouragement and support. She realized that her story had resonated with people because it was honest about both the triumphs and the struggles. She hadn't hidden her failures or her fears. She had shown them alongside her successes. October arrived again, bringing with it the anniversary of both Alice's arrival in Redwood Beach and Sarah's death. It had been 16 years since the accident, 1 year since the storm rescue. Alice woke early on the anniversary morning and walked to the harbor. The ocean was calm and peaceful, with the sunrise painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. She sat on the bench at the end of the pier, her favorite spot, and thought about everything that had happened in the past year. She had come out of hiding. She had faced her fears and saved lives. She had reconnected with her past and found a new purpose. She had trained a new generation of rescuers. She had made peace with Sarah's memory and with her own survival. She wasn't the same person who had arrived in Redwood Beach 16 years ago, broken and trying to disappear. But she also wasn't the same person who had been Storm Alice, the fearless pilot who seemed invincible. She was something in between, someone who acknowledged both her capabilities and her limitations, someone who understood that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the decision to act despite it. "Good morning, Alice." Alice turned to see Pastor Michael approaching. He sat down beside her on the bench. "I figured I might find you here," he said. "This is a significant day for you, isn't it?" "It is," Alice said. 16 years since I came here. 16 years since Sarah died. 1 year since the rescue." "How are you feeling?" Michael asked. Alice considered the question carefully. "Grateful," she finally said, "for the life I've had, for the people I've known, for the opportunities I've been given to make a difference, and for this town, which gave me sanctuary when I needed it, and then gave me the chance to be myself again." "The town is grateful too," Michael said. "You've given us so much, Alice. Not just the rescue, but your knowledge, your leadership, your example. You've shown us what it means to truly serve others." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the morning light spread across the water. Then Michael spoke again. "You know, in my line of work, I meet a lot of people who are struggling with guilt, with regret, with trauma. They ask me how they can move past it, how they can find peace. I usually talk about forgiveness, about faith, about time. But after watching your journey this past year, I've realized there's another path to healing." "What's that?" Alice asked. "Action," Michael said. "You didn't heal by forgetting what happened or by running away from it. You healed by taking action, by using your pain and your experience to help others. You transformed your trauma into purpose." Alice nodded slowly. "I think you're right. For 15 years, I was passive. I was hiding, waiting for the pain to go away on its own. But it wasn't until I took action, until I got on that boat and went out into the storm, that I started to really heal. And look at all the good that's come from that one decision," Michael said. "The lives you saved directly, the people you've trained who might save other lives in the future, the inspiration you've provided to thousands of people who saw your documentary. The ripples spread out in ways we can't even see." After Michael left, Alice remained on the bench for a long time. She thought about ripples, how one action creates effects that spread outward, touching more and more people over time. Sarah's decision to become a Coast Guard pilot had ripples that extended through all the people she had saved, all the people Alice had saved in partnership with her, and now all the people Alice was training. The ripples continued even after Sarah was gone. Alice pulled out her phone and called Jessica Mitchell. They had stayed in touch over the past year, talking every few weeks. "Hi, Alice," Jessica answered warmly. "I was just thinking about you. Today's the anniversary." "I know," Alice said. "I wanted to tell you that I'm thinking about Sarah today, remembering her with love and gratitude." "Thank you for saying that," Jessica said. "You know, my kids have been watching your documentary in school. Their teacher showed it as an example of public service and resilience. They came home so proud to tell me that their grandmother's best friend is Storm Alice." Alice smiled. "How does that make you feel?" "It makes me feel like my mother's legacy is being honored," Jessica said. "She was a hero too, Alice, just like you. And I'm glad the world is learning about both of you." That evening, Redwood Beach held a small ceremony to commemorate the first anniversary of the storm rescue. The town had installed a memorial plaque at the harbor, honoring the community's response to the emergency and recognizing the rescue team that had saved Jack, Marcus, and Tommy. Alice stood with Robert, Danny, Miguel, and Sarah Park as Mayor Linda Torres unveiled the plaque. It read, "In recognition of the Redwood Beach Rescue Team, who, on October 15th, risked their lives to save 3 fishermen during a severe storm. Through courage, skill, and community spirit, they embodied the best of maritime tradition. Let this memorial remind us that heroism can be found in ordinary people who take extraordinary action when others need help." The 3 fishermen who had been rescued stood beside the memorial. Jack Sullivan stepped forward to speak. "A year ago, I made a foolish decision that put my life and the lives of my crew in danger," Jack said. "I ignored warnings, trusted my pride instead of the forecast, and sailed into a storm that nearly killed us. But because of Alice Morgan and her team, we survived. They risked their own safety to save us, and I will be forever grateful." He turned to look at Alice. "Alice taught me something important that day. She taught me that real strength isn't about being fearless or never making mistakes. Real strength is about doing the right thing even when you're afraid, even when you're not sure you can succeed. She showed me what true courage looks like." Tommy Reeves spoke next. "Before the rescue, I thought of Miss Morgan as just a nice lady who worked at Ocean's Catch. I had no idea she was one of the most decorated Coast Guard pilots in history. But that's exactly the point. She didn't need recognition or praise. She was content to live quietly among us. But when we needed her, she was there. That's the definition of a hero in my book." After the ceremony, there was a reception at Ocean's Catch. Maria had closed the restaurant to regular customers and opened it for a community celebration. People gathered to eat, talk, and celebrate both the rescue and the community spirit that had made it possible. Alice found herself surrounded by people wanting to talk to her, but she noticed one person standing alone by the window, looking out at the harbor. It was Marcus Chen. Alice excused herself and went over to him. "You okay, Marcus?" she asked. Marcus turned to her with a thoughtful expression. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this past year," he said. "About risk, about the ocean, about life. I still fish. It's what I do, what I love. But I approach it differently now. I check the weather more carefully. I don't take unnecessary risks. I respect the ocean's power in a way I didn't before." "That's wise," Alice said. "But I also think about you," Marcus continued. "About how you gave up flying, gave up the career you loved because of what happened to Sarah. And I wonder, do you regret that decision? Do you wish you had kept flying?" Alice was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly. "I don't know," she finally said. "At the time, I couldn't imagine continuing. The trauma was too fresh, the grief too overwhelming. Maybe if I had stayed, I could have worked through it and kept flying. Or maybe I would have had a breakdown and endangered my crew. I'll never know. But coming here, living this quiet life, do you think it was the right choice?" "I think it was the choice I needed to make at that time," Alice said. "I needed to step back, to heal, to figure out who I was without the Coast Guard, and Redwood Beach gave me that opportunity. But now, a year after the rescue, I'm starting to think that healing doesn't mean hiding. It means integrating your past with your present and moving forward." Marcus nodded. "I like that. Integrating rather than hiding. The rescue taught me that I'm still Storm Alice," Alice said. "I still have those skills, that knowledge, that drive to help people. I just express it differently now. I'm not flying helicopters, but I'm training people who might save lives. I'm not in active service, but I'm serving my community in other ways. It's different, but it's still meaningful." As winter turned to spring, Alice received an unexpected phone call from Admiral Robert Carson, the current commander of Coast Guard Pacific Area. "Ms. Morgan," Admiral Carson said, "I've been following your work this past year with great interest. The documentary, the training programs, the community response team, it's all very impressive." "Thank you, Admiral," Alice said, "but I'm just doing what I can with the experience I have." "That's exactly why I'm calling," Admiral Carson said. "We have a problem in the Coast Guard. We're losing a lot of institutional knowledge as experienced personnel retire. Skills and insights that took decades to develop are walking out the door. We need to find ways to capture and preserve that knowledge for future generations." "I understand the challenge," Alice said, "but how can I help?" "We want to create a new program, a senior advisory corps made up of retired Coast Guard personnel with specialized expertise," Admiral Carson explained. "These advisors would conduct training, develop curriculum, mentor active duty personnel, and provide consultation on complex operations. We'd like you to be one of the founding members of this corps." Alice was stunned. "Admiral, I'm 68 years old. I've been retired for 16 years. Surely there are more current people who would be better suited." "Ms. Morgan, you have 25 years of search and rescue experience, including some of the most challenging rescues in Coast Guard history. You've proven in the past year that you can teach effectively and inspire others. And your story resonates with people in a way that pure technical expertise never could. We need you." "Can I think about it?" Alice asked. "Of course," Admiral Carson said, "but please don't underestimate the value of what you have to offer." After the call ended, Alice sat in her apartment, looking at the photograph of herself and Sarah. What would Sarah think about this opportunity? Alice knew the answer. Sarah would tell her to do it, to embrace this chance to serve again in a new way. Alice called Jessica Mitchell and told her about the offer. "Alice, this is incredible," Jessica said. "You have to do it." "I don't know," Alice said hesitantly. "It would mean more traveling, more time away from Redwood Beach. This town has become my home." "And it will still be your home," Jessica said. "But you have so much knowledge, so much experience that could help save lives. My mother would want you to share that with as many people as possible." Alice also talked to Maria, who encouraged her to accept the position. "Alice, you'll always have a job here if you want it," Maria said. "But this is a chance to make a bigger difference. You should take it." After a week of consideration, Alice called Admiral Carson and accepted the position with the Senior Advisory Corps. She would work part-time, conducting training sessions and consultations while maintaining her base in Redwood Beach. Over the next few months, Alice traveled to Coast Guard stations around the country. She taught advanced rescue techniques to helicopter pilots. She consulted on the development of new training simulators. She participated in exercises where she evaluated crew performance and provided feedback. The work was challenging and sometimes exhausting, but Alice found it deeply fulfilling. She was using her skills and experience in ways she had never imagined possible. And everywhere she went, she met young Coast Guard personnel who were eager to learn from her. One day at Air Station San Francisco, the same station where Alice had served for most of her career, she was conducting a seminar on decision-making during rescue operations. After the session, a young pilot approached her. "Commander Morgan," the pilot said. Alice had been given an honorary rank as part of the Senior Advisory Corps. "I just wanted to tell you that you were my inspiration for joining the Coast Guard. I saw your documentary when I was in college, and it made me want to become a rescue pilot." Alice felt tears prick her eyes. "What's your name?" "Lieutenant Amy Chen," the pilot said. Alice did a double take. "Chen? Are you related to Robert Chen from Redwood Beach?" "He's my uncle," Amy said with a smile. "After the rescue last year, I heard so much about you from my family. Uncle Robert wouldn't stop talking about how you commanded that operation. It reinforced my decision to pursue this career. Your uncle is a good man, Alice said. He was brave to go out in that storm with me. He says you taught him what real leadership looks like, Amy said. And now you're teaching me. Thank you for that. These moments, seeing the ripple effects of her work, meeting people who had been inspired by her story, knowing that her experience was being used to train the next generation, gave Alice a sense of purpose that she hadn't felt in years. But she always returned to Redwood Beach. The small coastal town remained her anchor, her home, the place where she had found herself again. She still worked at Ocean's Catch a few days a week, still took her morning walks along the harbor, still sat on the bench at the end of the pier and watched the ocean. The community response team continued to meet and train regularly. Danny Morrison had been accepted into the Coast Guard and was currently in training. He wrote to Alice often, sharing his experiences and asking for advice. Alice felt like a proud parent watching him grow and develop. Sarah Park had become the team leader in Alice's absence, and she was doing an excellent job. The team had responded to several emergencies during the year, always performing professionally and effectively. One evening in late spring, Alice was having dinner at Ocean's Catch when Jack Sullivan came in. He sat down at her table without being invited, something he had started doing over the past year as they had become friends. "I have news," Jack said. "I'm retiring from fishing." Alice was surprised. "Really? You love fishing." "I do," Jack said. "But I'm 73 years old, and that storm taught me something. I'm not as sharp as I used to be. My decision-making isn't what it should be. It's time to let younger, smarter people take the risks." "What will you do?" Alice asked. "I'm going to work with Robert and the community response team," Jack said. "Teaching the youngsters about ocean conditions, weather patterns, the things I've learned in 50 years of fishing. I might not be able to go out in storms anymore, but I can help prepare others to handle them safely." Alice smiled. "That sounds like an excellent plan. We can use your expertise." "I learned that from you," Jack said. "You showed me that retirement from one thing doesn't mean retirement from making a difference. You're 68, and you're doing some of the most important work of your life. Why should I be any different?" As Alice walked home that evening, she reflected on how much had changed in just 2 years. She had gone from hiding her past to embracing it, from living in fear to living with purpose, from isolation to connection, from believing her useful life was over to discovering new ways to serve. She thought about Sarah and about the promise she had made in those terrible moments when the helicopter was sinking. She had promised to survive, but she had done more than just survive. She had found a way to live fully, to honor Sarah's memory through service to others, to transform her grief into something meaningful. 2 years after the storm rescue, Alice received an invitation that surprised her. The Coast Guard was having a ceremony to rename Air Station San Francisco's search and rescue hangar. They wanted to call it the Sarah Mitchell Memorial Hangar in honor of Sarah's service and sacrifice. And they wanted Alice to speak at the dedication ceremony. Alice called Jessica to tell her about the invitation. "Your mother is going to be honored with a memorial hangar," Alice said. "How do you feel about that?" Jessica was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "I think it's wonderful," she said. "My mother gave her life in service to the Coast Guard mission. Having her name on that hangar means that future generations will know about her, will be inspired by her example." "Will you come to the ceremony?" Alice asked. "I think you should be there." "Absolutely," Jessica said. "And Alice, I'm glad you'll be speaking. Nobody knew my mother better than you did." The day of the ceremony was clear and beautiful, with a strong wind blowing in from the ocean, the kind of day that Sarah would have loved. Alice stood in front of the hangar with Jessica and Sarah's 2 grandchildren, looking at the building where she and Sarah had started so many missions together. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people: active duty Coast Guard personnel, retirees, officials from the Department of Homeland Security, and members of the local community. Alice saw many familiar faces, including several people she had flown with during her career. When it was time for Alice to speak, she walked to the podium and looked out at the assembled crowd. For a moment, she felt nervous. This was different from teaching a class or conducting a training session. This was personal, emotional, important. "Thank you all for being here today," Alice began. "We're gathered to honor Commander Sarah Mitchell, who gave her life in service to the Coast Guard's mission of saving lives. Sarah was my co-pilot, my partner, and my best friend. We flew together for 20 years, and in that time, we saved hundreds of lives together." Alice paused, gathering her thoughts. "Sarah was the best pilot I ever knew. She had incredible skill, unshakable courage, and a dedication to the mission that inspired everyone around her. But more than that, she was a good person, kind, funny, loyal, and always willing to help others. The night Sarah died, we were on a rescue mission in severe weather. Our helicopter crashed, and Sarah became trapped. I tried to free her, but I couldn't. In her final moments, even as she was facing death, Sarah's concern was for me and the rest of the crew. She made me promise to survive, to get out while I still could." Alice's voice wavered slightly, but she continued. "I kept that promise. I survived. But for many years, I felt guilty about surviving when Sarah didn't. I felt like I had failed her, failed my crew, failed the mission. That guilt drove me to leave the Coast Guard and hide from everything I had been. But over time, I've learned that Sarah wouldn't have wanted that. She wouldn't have wanted me to waste my survival on guilt and regret. She would have wanted me to honor her memory by continuing to serve, by using the skills and knowledge we developed together to help others." Alice looked directly at the active duty personnel in the audience. "That's what this memorial hanger represents. It's not just a tribute to one person who died. It's a reminder of what we're all here to do, to put our lives on the line to save others, to face danger with courage, to never give up even in the hardest circumstances. Every time you walk into this hangar to start a mission, I want you to remember Sarah Mitchell. Remember her skill, her courage, her dedication. And remember that the work you do matters. The risks you take have meaning. The lives you save create ripples that spread out through families, communities, and time. Sarah saved countless lives during her career. She trained pilots who went on to save countless more lives. And now, her name on this hangar will inspire future generations to carry on that mission. That's a legacy worth celebrating." Alice concluded her speech with a quote that Sarah had often used. "The sea does not reward those who are too anxious, too greedy, or too impatient, but it does reward those who are brave, skillful, and dedicated to saving lives." Sarah Mitchell was all of those things, and we are all better for having known her. The ceremony concluded with a flyover by a formation of Coast Guard helicopters. As Alice watched them pass overhead, she felt a sense of peace. Sarah's memory was being honored. Her legacy would continue. And Alice had finally found a way to transform her grief into something meaningful and lasting. After the ceremony, many people came up to Alice to thank her for her speech and to share their own memories of Sarah. Alice met young pilots who had never known Sarah but were inspired by her story. She met retired personnel who had flown with Sarah and remembered her fondly. She met family members who were grateful that Sarah's sacrifice was being recognized. One elderly man approached Alice with tears in his eyes. "Commander Morgan," he said, "you probably don't remember me, but you and Commander Mitchell saved my life 30 years ago. My boat was sinking in a storm, and you pulled me out of the water. I've thought about you two every day since then. Thank you for what you did." Alice was moved by his words. "What's your name?" she asked. "Tom Bradley," he said. "I was a fisherman back then. After you saved me, I went back to school and became a teacher. I've taught for 28 years now. I've taught hundreds of students. And I always tell them about the 2 Coast Guard pilots who risked their lives to save mine. You and Commander Mitchell changed my life. And through me, you've touched all those students' lives too." This was exactly what Alice had talked about in her speech, the ripples spreading outward through time. Sarah's decision to become a Coast Guard pilot had led to saving Tom Bradley's life, which had led to him becoming a teacher and influencing hundreds of students. The effects of one person's service could be immeasurable. That evening, Alice had dinner with Jessica and her family. Jessica's children, Sarah's grandchildren, were full of questions about their grandmother. "Was Grandma Sarah scary when she flew in storms?" asked Emma, the younger grandchild. "No, she wasn't scary," Alice said with a smile. "She was calm and focused. Even in the worst weather, she never panicked. She would just assess the situation and do what needed to be done." "I want to be a pilot like Grandma Sarah," announced Michael, the older grandchild. Jessica smiled at Alice. "See what you've started? Between the documentary and today's ceremony, my kids are obsessed with the Coast Guard." "There are worse obsessions," Alice said. "The Coast Guard needs good people." Later that night, back in her hotel room, Alice stood at the window looking out at the San Francisco Bay. This city held so many memories for her. Decades of service, countless missions, triumphs, and tragedies. She had run away from this place, tried to leave it all behind. But now she was back, not as a fugitive from her past, but as someone who had integrated that past with her present. Her phone rang. It was Maria calling from Redwood Beach. "How did the ceremony go?" Maria asked. "It was beautiful," Alice said. "Emotional, but beautiful." "When are you coming home?" Maria asked. Alice smiled at the question. Home was Redwood Beach now, not San Francisco. That shift had happened so gradually that she hadn't even noticed it. "Tomorrow," Alice said. "I have a training session with the community response team this weekend." "Good," Maria said. "We miss you here. And by the way, Ocean's Catch needs you on Tuesday. We have a big reservation and we're short-staffed." Alice laughed. "I'll be there." Same old Alice, serving soup and taking orders. "Not the same old Alice," Maria corrected gently. "The new Alice. The one who's figured out how to be all the things she is. Coast Guard legend, teacher, mentor, and yes, a damn good server at Ocean's Catch." On a warm morning in late summer, Alice celebrated her 69th birthday. She woke early, as usual, and walked to the harbor to watch the sunrise. The ocean was calm, sparkling in the early light. Fishing boats were heading out for the day's work, and Alice recognized most of them by sight now. She sat on her favorite bench and thought about the journey she had been on. 3 years since the storm rescue that had changed everything. 16 years since Sarah's death. 47 years since she had first joined the Coast Guard. Almost 7 decades of life, full of triumphs and tragedies, successes and failures, joy and sorrow. "Mind if I join you?" Alice turned to see Robert Chen approaching with 2 cups of coffee from the bakery. He handed one to Alice and sat down beside her. "I figured you'd be here," Robert said. "Happy birthday, by the way." "Thank you," Alice said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "How did you know?" "Small town," Robert said with a grin. "Everyone knows everything. Maria is planning a surprise party at the restaurant tonight, so act surprised when you show up for your shift." Alice laughed. "I'll do my best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sipping their coffee and watching the harbor activity. Then Robert spoke. "Alice, can I ask you something?" "It's kind of philosophical." "Sure," Alice said. Do you think people can really change? Robert asked. I mean, fundamentally change who they are? Alice considered the question carefully. I don't think people change who they fundamentally are, she said. But I think they can change how they express who they are, how they understand themselves, how they live their lives. Why do you ask? I've been thinking about the past 3 years, Robert said. Before the storm rescue, I thought I was just a fisherman and a boat owner. That was my whole identity. But after that day, after being part of saving those lives, I discovered this whole other part of myself, someone who could lead, who could teach, who could organize the community response team. It's like I became a different person. But you didn't become a different person, Alice said. You always had those leadership qualities. You always had the desire to help others. The rescue just gave you an opportunity to express those qualities in a new way. You didn't change, you expanded. Robert nodded slowly. What about you? Did you change when you came to Redwood Beach? I thought I was changing, Alice said. I thought I was leaving Storm Alice behind and becoming someone new. But I was wrong. I was just hiding parts of myself, suppressing aspects of who I really was. The rescue forced me to admit that I was still that person, still a rescuer, still someone who would risk herself to help others. I couldn't escape who I fundamentally was. So, what's the lesson? Robert asked. I think the lesson is that we need to accept all of who we are, Alice said. Not just the parts we like or the parts that are convenient. All of it. Our skills and our limitations, our courage and our fears, our successes and our failures. When we try to hide or deny parts of ourselves, we end up incomplete, fragmented. But when we integrate everything, past and present, strengths and weaknesses, that's when we become whole. Robert raised his coffee cup. To becoming whole, then. Alice clinked her cup against his. To becoming whole. That evening, Alice showed up for her shift at Ocean's Catch and acted appropriately surprised when Maria led her into a dining room full of friends. The entire community response team was there, along with many of her regular customers and friends from around Redwood Beach. Speech! Speech! Someone called out. Alice stood up, feeling a bit embarrassed, but also deeply touched. I'm not good at speeches, she began. Well, actually, I'm fine at speeches about rescue techniques and helicopter operations, but speeches about feelings? Not my strength. Everyone laughed. But I want to say thank you, Alice continued. Thank you for giving me a home when I needed one. Thank you for accepting me without demanding to know my secrets. Thank you for allowing me to be invisible when I wanted to be, and for celebrating me when I finally stepped back into the light. This town gave me something I desperately needed, a second chance. And thank you for the past 3 years, for letting me teach, for learning from me, for being part of a community that takes care of its own. At 69, I thought my useful life was behind me. But you've shown me that age is just a number. What matters is whether we're willing to use what we know to help others. Danny Morrison stood up. He was home on leave from Coast Guard training. I have something to say. 3 years ago, I was just a kid working at the marina with no direction in life. Then Alice Morgan showed up and led a rescue operation that saved 3 lives. Watching her work, learning from her, inspired me to join the Coast Guard. I'm now training to be a rescue swimmer, and it's the best decision I've ever made. Alice didn't just save Jack, Marcus, and Tommy that day. She saved me too, in a different way. She showed me what I could become. Sarah Park spoke next. I've been an EMT for 5 years, but I learned more from Alice in 6 months than I learned in all my formal training combined. She taught me that medical knowledge is important, but calm leadership in a crisis is what really saves lives. I use what she taught me every single day. One by one, People stood up to share how Alice had influenced their lives. The stories ranged from small moments of kindness to life-changing inspiration. Alice listened with growing amazement, realizing the full extent of the ripple effects she had created. Jack Sullivan was the last to speak. 3 years ago, I was arrogant and foolish. I thought my experience made me invincible. Alice saved my life, but more than that, she taught me humility. She showed me that real wisdom comes from understanding your limitations, not denying them. At 73, I'm still learning, still growing, thanks to her example. After the party, Alice walked home slowly, savoring the warm summer evening. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jessica Mitchell. "Happy birthday, Alice. Mom would be so proud of who you've become." Alice replied, "Thank you. I hope I'm making her proud." Jessica's response came quickly. "You are." Every single day. Back in her apartment, Alice looked around at the space that had been her home for nearly 17 years. The photograph of her and Sarah sat on the bookshelf, no longer a source of pain, but a reminder of friendship and shared purpose. The medals and commendations were displayed on the wall, symbols of a life of service that continued in new forms. Alice realized that she had finally achieved what she had been seeking when she first came to Redwood Beach: peace. But not the peace of hiding or forgetting. The peace of acceptance, of integration, of understanding that her past and present were both part of who she was. She thought about the young pilots she was training through the Senior Advisory Corps. She thought about the community response team members who were learning to save lives. She thought about the thousands of people who had seen her documentary and been inspired to serve others in their own ways. The ripples continued spreading outward, touching lives she would never know about, creating effects she couldn't measure. And that was okay. She didn't need to see every result. She just needed to keep doing the work, keep sharing her knowledge, keep being true to who she was. Storm Alice, server at Ocean's Catch, teacher, mentor, friend, community member. All of these identities were real, and all of them were her. 5 years later, Alice Morgan turned 74. She was still working part-time at Ocean's Catch, still conducting training sessions for the Coast Guard Senior Advisory Corps, still mentoring the Redwood Beach Community Emergency Response Team. The team had grown to over 40 members and had become a model program that other coastal communities were copying. Danny Morrison had completed his Coast Guard training and was now a fully qualified rescue swimmer deployed at Air Station Los Angeles. Sarah Park had become the lead EMT instructor for maritime emergencies in Northern California. Alice had slowed down a bit. She walked a little slower, tired a little more easily, and had to be more careful about not overextending herself physically. But her mind was as sharp as ever, and her teaching had become even more effective as she learned to adapt her methods for different learning styles. One morning, Alice received an unexpected visitor at her apartment. It was Amy Chen, Robert's niece, who was now a lieutenant in the Coast Guard and a fully qualified rescue pilot. "Commander Morgan," Amy said, "I have news. I've been selected to serve as an instructor pilot at the Coast Guard Aviation Training Center. I'll be teaching the next generation of rescue pilots." "That's wonderful, Amy," Alice said. "You'll be an excellent instructor." "I learned from the best," Amy said. "You taught me that being a good pilot isn't just about technical skills. It's about decision-making, leadership, and understanding that every choice you make affects the lives of others. I'm going to pass those lessons on to my students." Alice felt tears in her eyes. This was it, the ripple continuing. She had taught Amy, who would teach others, who would teach others still. The knowledge and wisdom Alice had gained over her career would continue spreading long after she was gone. "Sarah would be proud," Alice said softly. "I think she would be proud of both of us." Amy replied. That evening, Alice walked to the harbor and sat on her favorite bench. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds. The ocean was calm, reflecting the colors like a mirror. Alice thought about the journey she had been on, from young pilot to legendary Storm Alice, from traumatized survivor to hiding refugee, from reluctant rescuer to peace with her past, from isolated individual to integrated member of a community. She had learned so many lessons along the way, that running from your past doesn't work. You have to integrate it with your present. That age doesn't determine value. Experience and wisdom matter at any stage of life. That courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking action despite the fear. That healing doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from transforming pain into purpose. That one person's service creates ripples that spread outward in ways impossible to measure. That community matters. We need each other, and we're strongest when we support one another. That it's never too late to find purpose, to make a difference, to become who you're meant to be. Alice pulled out her phone and looked at a recent photo that Jessica had sent her. It showed Jessica's son, Michael, now a teenager, standing in front of a Coast Guard helicopter. He had just been accepted into the Coast Guard Academy and would begin training next year. 3 generations now touched by the service that Alice and Sarah had shared. The ripple continuing, spreading, reaching people Alice would never meet, but whose lives would be affected by the choices she and Sarah had made decades ago. Alice looked up at the darkening sky and spoke to her old friend. We did good work, Sarah. It's still going on, still making a difference. Your legacy lives on in ways you never could have imagined. I hope you can see it, wherever you are. I hope you know that your sacrifice mattered, that your life had meaning, that you're not forgotten. A gentle breeze blew across the water, and Alice chose to believe it was Sarah's way of responding, of letting her know that yes, she could see, and yes, she was proud of what Alice had become. Alice stood up slowly, feeling the stiffness in her knees but not minding it. She was 74 years old. She had lived a full life, sometimes painful, sometimes joyful, always meaningful. And she wasn't done yet. There were still students to teach, still communities to serve, still lives to touch. She walked back toward town, toward the lights of Ocean's Catch, where Maria was probably starting the dinner service, toward her small apartment where she would read for a while before bed, toward another tomorrow full of possibilities. Storm Alice had finally come home, not to a place, but to herself. And in doing so, she had shown others that it's never too late to find your purpose, never too late to serve, never too late to be who you really are. The ripple continues, spreading outward, touching lives, creating effects that reach far beyond what any one person can see or measure. That's the nature of service, of dedication, of living a life that matters. And that's the legacy of Alice Morgan, both the Storm Alice of her past and the Alice of her present. All of her, integrated and whole, still making a difference, still saving lives in ways both direct and indirect. The story doesn't end here. It continues in the pilots Alice trained, in the community members she inspired, in the lives saved by people who learned from her example. It continues in small acts of courage, in moments of decision when someone chooses to help rather than hide, in the eternal truth that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when called upon. The ocean keeps rolling, the storms keep coming, and somewhere, someone trained by Alice or inspired by her story is stepping up to face the challenge, to save a life, to be the hero someone needs. That's the ripple. That's the legacy. That's the truth that Alice Morgan discovered in a small coastal town called Redwood Beach. That service never really ends. It just changes form. and that who we are at our core remains constant, even as everything else changes around us. The sun has set now, but tomorrow it will rise again, and Alice Morgan will rise with it, ready for another day of teaching, serving, and being exactly who she is meant to be. Storm Alice is home, and the ripple continues. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most, and where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.